one of you is, what do you think happens when you die? In fact, that's a question that I ask everybody who I have the honor of sitting with as they are in their last days. I ask them that very same question. It helps me to understand how to minister to them, but it also leads to always a very meaningful discussion. And that's not surprising. I mean, this is one of the fundamental questions that every religion, and in fact every person, seeks to answer. And that has been going on since consciousness happened. I mean, you've got heaven and hell. That's one choice. You've got reincarnation. You've got dust to dust. You've got ghosts and souls. You've got family planets or outer darkness. There's a bunch of virgins sometimes. There's tunnels of light. All sorts of ideas. And I know that there are people in this room that find that at least one of those ideas that I mentioned is true to their understanding. Probably not the virgin's one. My own understanding of death begins actually with my thoughts on being, my ontology. And my thoughts on being rest on a proposition based on observation. The observation is that all being is interconnected, interdependent. Now, I must admit that I am relying in this on the wisdom and observation of others as much as on my own observation. And even the understandings of the wisest have their limits. And so this finally becomes a question of faith. My faith extrapolates the trajectory of my limited observation and makes it meaningful. Faith is required for this proposition because even the most sage yogi or most driven scientific philosopher cannot comprehend the whole of being, nor even the whole of being in their immediate vicinity. Consider that the part of the electromagnetic spectrum that is visible to us is less than a 10 trillionth of its whole. There are entire ecologies and vistas of being in this room, in your body, that we do not possess the senses to perceive. I do not perceive, nor am I aware of most of the immediate reality in which I exist, by a lot. And this opens the door to many possibilities. So we craft ourselves and our world from our senses, the senses that do work for us, and interface that with our consciousness in order to make meaning. But our senses are not cued to, for instance, the odor of butyric acid, like the deaf and blind tick, nor to electrical fields like the black ghost knifefish, nor to air compression waves like an echolocating bat. We do not perceive these things in any way that is significant to us, if at all. So that's understanding number one. We don't see the whole picture. We are limited by our senses, and we limit ourselves or regulate our senses in terms of their processing so that they cooperate together and make sense. And the sense that they give us is that we are discrete beings differentiated from other beings who decide what to do in a framework of time. And yet, of all the things that we are geared to sense, the most amazing one has no single receptor, like skin or eyes, and is entirely mysterious in its origins, location, and to a significant degree in its component parts. This most amazing thing we sense is our sense of consciousness. Consciousness has no mass, it has no weight, it has no volume. We cannot measure its movement, but we know that it's there. Just because we know it. And neurologists and philosophers and mystics and ministers are confounded to prove anything about the origin of consciousness. So while most of what is not sensible to us, the most important sense that we have doesn't make sense. The very thing we use, thing, quotation marks, I don't know, consciousness, the very thing we use to understand the world and ourselves cannot itself be understood. This might be a good time to remind everyone that marijuana is still illegal in Arizona. Though you will have the opportunity to change that come November. The question of consciousness is central to the post-life question. What is reincarnated? What lives on the family planet? What reconciles with God? What ceases to exist? What frolics with virgin? If not you? And what are you, if not your consciousness? So this is understanding number 2. We do not know what we are. Let's return to the interdependent web of existence, because this observation does 2 really tricky things as we consider death. If we imagine that every event, every action, every decision, every molecule and social movement is interdependent, then free will, as it has come to be thought of popularly, is an utter fiction. And in fact, the social, psychological, and neurological sciences generally agree that free will is a convenient self-deception, a useful self-deception. So how does free will have anything to do with death? Well, it doesn't. But what rises from its ashes does. I'll speak more on that in a little bit. So that's the first thing that falls out of the interconnected web of existence. The second thing is that if we imagine that every moment, every event, every action, every decision, every molecule, every evolutionary process from the Big Bang onward is interdependent, if because the very first thing happened, the very last thing is bound to happen, because everything in between is connected. If that happens because this happened, and everything else in between is because that happened, if all of that, if existence is interdependent, then the when of when things happen doesn't really matter so much. Because of this, then this. It's all bound to happen. And if it is bound to happen, time is at its most irrelevant and possibly as much of a deception as free will. If everything is interdependent, then everything that has ever happened or ever will happen may as well happen in an instant. And then time would become the filter that we use to make sense of it. Speculating here, but perhaps time, like taste and smell, is a sense. So understandings number 3 and 4, free will is illusory and time is not what we think it is. Right now, you're hoping you remembered to register to vote. But wait, there's more. According to one of the more prominent neuroscientists on the scene today, David Eagleman, he said, quote, "The days of thinking of time as a river, evenly flowing, always advancing, are over." Time perception, just like vision, is a construction of the brain and is shockingly easy to manipulate experimentally. And from those experiments, he has determined that awareness is post-dictive, which means that awareness registers or occurs milliseconds after events occur. Post-dictive, got it? We perceive or sense something before we are aware that we perceive or sense it. Eagleman has found out that, quoting again, awareness is post-dictive, incorporating data from a window of time after an event and delivering a retrospective interpretation of what happened. And that's awareness. Milliseconds. But while this is happening in an infinitesimally brief moment of time, what it means nonetheless is that awareness happens after we act, which further undermines the common conception of free will. But also, and more mind-blowing, that awareness is post-dictive means that awareness is memory. Awareness is memory. This is a memory. Right now. And then if we could roughly equate awareness with consciousness, then we can say that consciousness is a memory, perhaps. And then what is memory if the experience of time is an illusion? Another way to say this is, what is memory if the experience of time is a memory? Do you wish it was November yet? Understanding number 5, awareness is a memory. So to recap so far, because all being is interconnected, time and free will are illusory. There is 1 trillion times more being in this room than we can perceive. The question of consciousness is central, mystifying, and possibly a function of memory. But what happens when you die? You have a minute to think about that. So I titled today's reflection, The UU Book of the Dead, modeled, of course, on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is sort of a TripAdvisor for dying. But I understand that it's also a guide to living. It is sometimes called the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And I think that's appropriate, because if you ask me what I think happens to you when you die, I think the answer might be the same thing that happens when you live. And here's what I mean. For me, it's all a question of faith and faithfulness, and I'll defend that in a moment. But first, I want to say that I have a great deal of conviction that life is a matter of faith and faithfulness. But when it comes to death, having never died before, we will be entering deeply speculative waters. Or I guess I should say, considering what the children said today, having never knowingly died before, we will be entering deeply speculative waters. So how is life a question of faith and faithfulness? Faith is a story that is meaningful beyond our ability to prove it as factual, or even if it is factual, its meaning is effective beyond its factualness. What's more, given that we exist as motes of perception in an ocean of being, it would seem that all facts are facts only insofar as they are relevant to our senses. There's a lot more beyond our senses than our senses make sense of. And some of that other being is actually relevant to us beyond our perception. We make do with what senses we have to fashion a coherent and meaningful story of the world we perceive. And that is an act of faith. And that story shapes our behavior. But wait, isn't behavior an act of will? And didn't I say free will is an illusion? Kind of. But here's another mind-melting question. If we have no free will, what is the point of consciousness? Evolutionarily speaking, what's the point of post-dictive awareness? Now that we have it would indicate that there is indeed a use. Well, I believe it's because stories shape our behavior. Or as Eagleman submits, perceptions are representations of information that cognitive systems can work with later. Stories are what rises from the ashes of free will. We can craft our stories. Our agency lies in the stories we tell about who we are. Memory is a story of a kind. Memory is also shaped by the narratives we have of ourselves and the narratives handed to us by our culture. We are the stories we tell, given the sliver of reality that we perceive with the senses we have. And this leads me to a hypothesis. Consciousness, or awareness, is the memory of our sensory input interacting with our guiding stories. Reality itself is not a story, but awareness, consciousness, memory are shaped by stories. Now, these are myths, these are family histories, stories that your mom tells about you. They shape you. Stories that you tell about yourself when you look in the mirror shape you. And I'm not saying it's easy, because it is not. But if you want to change your life, change the story you tell about yourself. Change the story you hear about yourself. And then within the constraints of your biology, like you cannot tell yourself that you can fly and then fly, that doesn't work. But within the constraints of your biology, live into that story. And stories take maintenance. It takes work, especially heroic and transformative ones. Those stories call us. So we make a habit of our stories until they are second nature, until our stories become subconscious and predictive. And this takes practice, lots of practice. And that, by the way, is exactly what we are doing every Sunday here at MVUU. We are practicing our story. There are tremendous benefits to practicing with others who are telling a similar story. Now, if you are telling one story and living another, you will have problems. And probably make problems for others. You will not be exercising the agency that you do possess. That is what I call unfaithful living. It is an unfaithful way of living, because you are not being faithful to your own faith, to your own story. So faith and faithfulness. Story determines behavior. Story shapes memory. Memory is awareness. So what happens when you die? I don't know. I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. I don't know. But that's not the end. I don't know. But this is my faith, which is a kind of knowing, I suppose. Everything is interconnected. We don't see the whole picture. We do not know what we are. Free will is illusory. Time is not what we think it is. Awareness is perhaps a memory. We are the stories we tell. And therein lies our responsibility and hope. Based on that, I imagine that when we die and our senses begin to break down as discrete and different receptors, which includes our sense of time and perhaps our sense of consciousness. That is to say, our sense that we are a discrete consciousness begins to break down. Perhaps we discover that consciousness is part of the web of reality, that it is not generated by us and is not ours, but that our particular consciousness is only the sliver of the universal consciousness that our personally particular senses perceive. Now that's pretty far out, and it's pure speculation. I'm not sure I believe it, but I can imagine that. And I think it's an interesting thing to meditate on. Less far out, but still speculatively, because this all is speculation, because I've never knowingly died before. Perhaps in the instant of dying, time fails and consciousness opens. If that happens, we might then see the whole narrative all at once, or at least a far larger slice than we normally get. We might see loves long gone. Maybe we see things yet to come if everything's interconnected. And it may not be eternity, but with time set aside, it may as well be. It is an eternal moment. And that moment is spent in the story we have deeply practiced into our pre-consciousness. So if you are a true blue, traditional Christian, you might see clouds and your family, a warm light sensation reaching out to you, because that is the story that is deeply embedded in you. Would account for all the varied firsthand accounts of near-death experiences. And I don't think this understanding necessarily invalidates any of them, while including most of them as experiences that people are legitimately having. And if reality is different than experience, I am not sure at all that in that moment, that matters at all. This story helps me feel more comfortable with my own physical mortality. It also helps me fit alternative visions of death into my own. Further, it clarifies what I am to do with my life and with my position as a minister. That being faith and faithfulness, or in other words, habituating our story through intentional practice. That's what I want to do with my life. That's what I want to do from this spot. Habituate our story through intentional practice. In this death story, I have faith based on observation, plausibility, and hope. Certainly not certainty. I would even call it probability. Do I know it's true? No, I won't until I die, which means that for now anyway, I'm okay without verification. Look, if this reflection was a bit dense, and you want to go over it later to better understand, agree, or argue with what I've said, I'll put it up on the website in a PDF or a video in a day or two. Failing that, get out there and vote.